Okay, Chris Peaks back here today with Brandon Mosley for our BCS State of Alabama podcast. We got former Congressman Mo Brooks here with us today. Congressman, I guess the first thing, I gave you a list of topics, but I guess we didn't expect the assassination of Charlie Kirk. I know they've got somebody in custody today. Seems like all these assassination attempts are from radical leftists. Is that just something that they're taught or indoctrinated with?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's exclusively radical leftists because we've also had some Democrats who have been shot at and or killed over the last 10 to 15 years. But there is a frightening disparity between the numbers of conservatives who were shot at or killed versus leftists that are shot at or killed. And I don't know what the ratio is, but it's the preponderance of the people who are targets of assassination seem to be Republicans, seem to be conservatives, seem to be people who believe in free enterprise, seem to be people who are Christian and believe in moral values.
Congressman, do you believe some of that may be because on the right, I don't want to stereotype us, but we tend to believe in God and believe we are, at the end of the days, will be judged on our actions and our faith and our belief. While on the left, that, there's less belief in God and more in that the government is, the highest authority that you'll ever deal with. So if they become frustrated with the government and they don't have a God to answer to, it may be easier morally to explain extreme actions in their minds anyway.
That might be part of it. But I think very similar to what you were saying is that if you believe in God, then the chances are you also believe in certain foundational moral principles. By way of example, the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill. And you also understand that there is a judgment day, an afterlife, in which your good deeds and bad deeds are evaluated. And that evaluation determines where you're going to spend the rest of eternity in that afterlife. But to me, the main thing is the teaching of moral values, the adoption of moral values versus the absence of moral values. And for whatever reason, a sizable disproportionate number of people on the left, they've never been taught the difference between right and wrong. They've never been taught moral values that help guide you to do the right thing with the talents and abilities you have as a human being versus the wrong thing. And so the absence of that moral compass, the absence of those moral values, that is, to me, what prompts a lot of these mass shootings, say, at schools or at shopping malls or at hotels like in Las Vegas. And society's got to do something about it. We can't keep thinking that there's not some relationship between the teaching of our youth of sound moral principles and people doing the right thing versus doing the wrong thing. There's a connection.
Congressman, you mentioned a while ago where you were when President Kennedy was assassinated. I've always been studied that, and seeing it and not knowing him, I think kind of desensitized to it. Us who was born afterwards, but after seeing that with Charlie Kirk, I feel like a void. I know he wasn't the president, but he definitely had a huge following. Was that the same feeling that happened when President Kennedy was assassinated?
Well, they're both horrific. And so, yes, the feelings from horrific things happening are similar. I mentioned before we went on air that I remember exactly where I was the moment that I found out that John F. Kennedy had been assassinated. And it's Weather Elementary School here in Huntsville, Alabama. And I'm about to go to grandparents' lunch and book fair with a couple of my grandkids at Weather Elementary. So every time I go into that school, I remember the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And the same is true for when say Steve Scalise was shot as part of an assassination attempt by Bernie Sanders' acolyte at a baseball field in Alexandria, Virginia. Now, that's a little bit different because I was a primary target of the assassin. I was one of 6 people on his assassination target list that he had in his pocket. It had our names, our office numbers, our physical descriptions, our age, identifying information that you would want if you want to target a particular person for assassination. But yeah, these kinds of horrific events do tend to stay with you. And Charlie Kirk's going to fall into that category. When I got a text message from my daughter, Chelsea Lee, that Charlie Kirk had been shot. Well, I know Charlie Kirk. I've been to some of these turning point events. I've spoken at least one of them that I recall, maybe more than one. And, those were very, very wholesome type events where people would discuss moral values. They would talk about public policy and what we as a people can do that would better America and better lives for Americans. And Charlie Kirk, the amount of time that he spent, the dedication that he had trying to make America a better place is truly noteworthy. And it's quite an accomplishment what he was able to do. And it's just horrifying that because he was trying to do so many good things for us, the people of America, that some evil man takes his life.
Yeah, I'm kind of like you, Mo. I met Charlie Kirk the first time when he was here in Alabama, talking to in 2018, talking to the Alabama Republican Executive Committee. And there's no telling how many people over the last 10 years in these various events that he's done, where he goes out and he addresses college students like he was doing Tuesday when he got killed, have interacted with him. So, I mean, the number of people impacted by this death has to be, into the hundreds of thousands.
I'd say millions, maybe tens of millions. It's a lot. He had a huge impact across America and the lives that he touched directly or indirectly.
There's a clip, I remember of Governor Wallace in '68 when he was running for president, and he said something about there's a side in this country, they believe in free speech if you let them speak. And, Charlie Kirk was one of the people that was out there pushing for free speech. I mean, is the time for, speaking with these people over with?
Well, they have tended to show a resistance to any kind of logic. And instead of having a polite discourse, you may disagree, but a polite discourse about those disagreements, they just want to shout you down. They just want to engage in violence to shut you up. And that's not the way a republic is supposed to function. And these people need to suffer consequences for their efforts to suppress freedom of speech. And it's one thing to have speech that aggravates you. That's the nature of being in a republic. There's going to be a lot of speech that aggravates you, but that doesn't mean that you go kill the person that aggravated you with their speech. But again, to me, it all comes down to declining moral values in the United States of America. And a lot of that is centered on some kind of apparent ban in our school system and the teaching of those moral values. Well, moral values, while they're related to religion, you can teach moral values without teaching a particular religion. And as such, there should be no prohibition from our public schools teaching moral values without running afoul of the First Amendment ban on government-sponsored religions, okay? But for some reason, the left in our society has used the First Amendment to undermine the moral values that help us understand basic principles like right versus wrong.
Along those lines, do we need to consider federal legislation where if you attack someone over their speech and kill them, that it's like raised, this may be at the state level as well, where it becomes a capital crime. Because I mean, obviously, if you kill somebody while you're robbing a bank, or if you kill a police officer doing his duty, that's a capital crime versus a regular murder. In this case, I mean, Kirk was killed because he expressed his First Amendment rights to free speech. And, President, Trump, if he had got killed at Butler, it was because of what he said and, who he was, and that some of these folks just can't debate him, so they have to kill him.
Well, I've given this some thought, and I agree with what the thrust of what you're saying, and I'd have a different net to try to catch these criminals and impose the death penalty. At some point, when you kill an individual, there is also an attack on the United States of America. That's a treasonous activity. And so, putting it all together and the threat to our republic, I believe we ought to have a mandatory, no exception death penalty for those individuals who kill somebody because they are a judge or in the judiciary, because they are an elected official, because they are in the executive branch at an administrative position, say anyone who's working in the White House. If you're killing them for those reasons, then it ought to be a mandatory death penalty. Very similar to what you just said, I would branch it out and say if you kill someone where the motivation is political, then it ought to be a mandatory death penalty. And if you had laws that did that at the federal level and at the state level, then this assassination in Utah would be a mandatory death penalty offense. And I'd have no exceptions. I wouldn't risk running afoul of the Equal Protection Clause. I'd just say, if you do this, it's a direct attack on society, on the United States of America, on our government, on our freedoms, on everything that we're blessed with in the United States of America. And that is deserving of enhanced punishment. And that enhanced punishment is capital. It's the death penalty if you in turn have murdered someone because you engaged in an attack on the United States of America like this.
Congressman, kind of shifting gears here. My next question I want to ask you, and I'll ask it just to everybody on social media, is what about the Epstein files?
Well, the taxpayers paid for them. They ought to be released, and they ought to be released in toto, and there should not be any redactions. It's owned by all these documents related to Epstein. They are owned by the people of the United States of America, because the United States of America taxpayers are the ones that paid for their creation and or accumulation. Give it back
Changing gears again on this Senate race. We've got Steve Marshall in here already. We've got Congressman Barry Moore, whom you served with in Washington. We've got businessman, cattleman Ronnie Walker, and we've got former Navy SEAL Jared Hudson. And yet all the polling I'm seeing is showing like 40% of likely Republican voters are undecided. Are they just waiting for someone else to get in, or do they just not know what they're doing?
Well, at this point, I'm not concerned about what the polling data is, because you won't know enough to make a firm decision until you get closer to the primary date. And so right now, a lot of the polling is based on name identification and little more. I've met 3 of these 4 individuals on a personal level. I like them. It's going to be a challenge for a lot of Alabama voters to determine which one is best of those 4. Plus, you got to include whoever else might jump in, and we'll see how all that plays out. But to me, the key question is not whether we want to send a typical person to the United States Senate, a typical politician to the United States Senate. We don't need in America right now average elected officials. We need superb elected officials who are committed to doing what needs doing to protect America on a lot of different fronts. We've talked about declining moral values. We've got to have elected officials who don't just talk the game, but actually take action to protect and promote those moral values that guide us as a country to do the right thing with our power rather than the wrong thing. Big issue to me is the threat of a national insolvency and bankruptcy. We're headed in that direction. Now, I have an economics background, okay? Graduated with distinction at Duke University in economics. That's the highest honor that you can get in economics at Duke University at that time. I don't know what it might be today, but that's what it was called back then. Plus, I've kept abreast of economic data whenever I can get my hands on it. And people, I don't think, understand the nature of the threat posed by potential national insolvency and bankruptcy. And if they had the kind of knowledge that I have about the threat of a national insolvency and bankruptcy, the threat of this $37 trillion in accumulated debt, the $1 trillion plus a year in debt service. And just this past week, the Congressional Budget Office published a report that said that in this fiscal year, the debt has already gone up more than $2 trillion. And there's still a month left in the fiscal year. That's horrific. And when you start getting unemployment levels that approach, if not surpass, what we saw in the Great Depression in the 1930s, when we had long soup and bread lines, as all sorts of efforts were being made just to make sure people didn't starve, okay? When you see that kind of potential setting, and then you add to it a government of the United States that's not solvent. In the 1930s, at least the central government was solvent. You have a national insolvency and bankruptcy, it won't be. And then you add to that the risk of terrorism that we have today that you didn't have in the 1930s, and the risk that our geopolitical foes will have access to weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear weapons. Terrorists might get their hands on nuclear weapons. And it's a horrific potential picture that gets painted that we have to guard against. And I don't know of maybe but a handful of people who are in the United States Congress, either as a congressman or a senator, that's willing to do the right thing, that's really willing to attack this deficit and debt issue head on in order to prevent those horrific consequences. And bringing it over to this Senate race, I don't know of anyone who's declared right now that has the kind of track record that should give you confidence that they're going to properly address the deficit and debt threat.
Along those same lines, do you have any ideas how we would go about lowering our debt? I mean, what's the first steps we should take?
The first step has to be to take a sizable meat cleaver to the spending that is now taking place at the federal government level. You have to. I'm not talking about just cutting waste, fraud, and abuse, which is the kind of lingo that politicians use all the time, okay? Unfortunately, there are some nice things or even some good things that we're going to have to cut simply because we don't have the money. And the alternative is to suffer national insolvency and bankruptcy where critical things are cut because we don't have the money. I mean, what are we going to do if we don't have enough money to pay for national defense? That's pretty serious stuff. Yet that's what happens when you have a national insolvency and bankruptcy. And again, I love reading about history, particularly military history. And what people need to understand about the Great Depression in the 1930s is it showed weakness on the part of the United States of America. And that weakness was exhibited in part in the form of significant cuts to our national defense capabilities in the 1930s. And those cuts in turn gave the impression to our enemies that they could actually fight a war with the United States of America and win it. Japan didn't bomb Pearl Harbor because Japan thought they were going to lose a war with the United States of America. They bombed Pearl Harbor because they thought they could win it. Italy and Nazi Germany did not also similarly declare war on the United States of America because they thought they were going to lose a war with the United States of America. They declared war on the United States of America and joined Japan and created the Axis powers because they thought they could win it. And they thought they could win it because our economy was in a shambles and our national defense structure had been decimated because when your economy is in a shambles, then you have a significant adverse effect on your ability to pay for quality national defense. So there has to be cuts, or else you're going to risk the United States of America's existence. But in addition to those kind of cuts, you have to engage in economic policy that actually grows the economy so that tax revenues go up. So those are the two solutions. One is very painful. Unfortunately, the alternative is death or akin to death. But I'm not going to try to put on rose-colored glasses here. It's not going to be easy to balance our budget, but it has to be done. We have no choice. The not painful solution is to improve the quality of our economy so that you have more tax revenue. And then I should add that any solution involving the deficit and debt, it has to be phased in. It can't be abrupt. You can't do it all of a sudden, because that risks crashing the economy, which in turn could crash revenues for the federal government, which in turn could actually make the deficit and debt situation worse. So there's a fine line, a fine path that you have to walk in order to get this problem dealt with successfully. And I don't have confidence in 90% of the members of the United States Congress or the United States Senate to do that right thing. And there are a number of reasons why I don't have that confidence. But the bottom line is, I don't have confidence in the people that the United States of America have elected to properly deal with that issue. In large part, all you gotta do is look at the track record of the last 20 years.
Congressman, Iran clearly has ambitions in the Middle East of being a more, maybe being the dominant, Muslim power in that region. North Korea still has ambitions towards South Korea. Russia clearly has they would like to pretty much add Ukraine, to their little empire, and maybe the Baltic states and maybe a chunk of Poland. And China wants Taiwan. And recently, Modi from India, met with, Li Jinping, in China, and Putin. They had a joint conference, and I think President Trump lamented that we had lost India. Are you concerned that we could see an axis of evil where the two most populous countries in the world, India and China, form an alliance with Russia? And I guess you can throw in North Korea and Iran as sidekicks. And, China wants to invade Taiwan. China has a massive army, but you can't move, that army that size 120 miles across ocean. You might be able to move 1 million troops at the most. Is there concern that if you throw India in there and India throws, let's say 100 divisions, and China throws 80, 90, 100 divisions in an invasion of like Poland with Russia at the helm? Because all three of those nations, have Soviet era equipment, so they have all the same replacement parts, allowing them to work together quite well. If you just threw that and you hit us at Taiwan, you hit us on the Korean border, you hit us, I guess at Iraq and Israel and at Poland and Estonia and Ukraine all at the same time, that given the state of our military and our European allies, that we couldn't handle that. I'm talking World War scenario here, but
if you're talking about the war, if all of those nations that you just listed were to become aggressors around the globe, there is virtually no chance that the United States of America could defend the world against that sizable of a military force. They would vastly outnumber us in numbers of soldiers. When you combine them, you're talking about North Korea, Iran, India, China, Russia, who knows whom else. Probably some terrorist organizations would join in that effort too. And no, the United States of America in a conventional setting could not beat them. We don't have the manpower. We don't have the technological edge in weaponry, and we don't have the economic capability to do what would be necessary to individually take on all of those nations put together. But having said that, that's a hypothetical you've got. I don't see those nations banding together. And it's not that long ago. I'm talking about recent history in the last months or years that India and Chinese forces were battling each other in the Himalayas. They have their own territorial disputes, so it's going to be very, very difficult for them to form any kind of long-term alliance given the hostility towards each other. And then you've got the Islamic Iran problem. Radical Muslims are attacking India on a regular basis, blowing up this, that, or the other, and killing a lot of Indian civilians. So I don't see India forming an alliance with Iran because Iran, they're meddling in the affairs of a lot of different nations, and they're using surrogates that engage in terroristic tactics. So I don't see India jumping on board with Iran. I do see the possibility of China and Russia trying to coordinate and stretch to the limit the ability of the United States of America to help our allies. That's a real possibility. And throw North Korea in on that, and you can throw Iran in on that. All of these are aggressor nations. Now, India is kind of the oddball, and I think it is probably the most stark example of Donald Trump's biggest, almost complete failure as a president, foreign policy. There's no logical reason why India should separate its alliance with the United States of America and bosom up to China, Russia, and Iran, okay? India is doing what it is doing because Donald Trump has gone out of its way to alienate the governmental leadership of India and the people of India. Donald Trump has a very bombastic, caustic way of dealing with the leaders of foreign nations, and they don't like it on a personal level, and that hurts. And then you add to it Donald Trump attacking India economically with his somewhat random, very erratic tariff policies, and that tends to alienate the rank and file people of India and a lot of other nations. And he's doing this all over the globe. So we have more strained relations with foreign nations under Donald Trump's failing foreign policy initiatives than we've had with any president in my lifetime. And there are risks associated with alienating people around the globe who otherwise would be our friends.
Congressman, kind of along those same lines, we've seen Russia send some, I think, unmanned drones into Poland. Do you think they're going to go after Poland next?
Well, it depends on what happens in Ukraine. The Russian leadership, Putin in particular, has made it clear that he wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union empire. And so that means that nations that used to fall under the USSR, they are all at risk of being reacquired one at a time if Europe, the free nations of Europe, and the United States continue to show chicken colors rather than brave colors. And when I say chicken colors, I'm talking about where you don't do what is necessary to help countries that are being invaded by an aggressor like Putin. So if the United States and Europe were to adequately finance the defense of Ukraine, Ukraine would win, okay? The combined economic and military prowess of Europe and the United States of America far exceed the capabilities of Russia. And it's an ideal situation because Ukraine isn't asking us to send American troops into Ukraine. He's not asking the French to send French troops into Ukraine. Don't get me wrong, he'd love them, but that's not his plea. Zelensky's plea is for military and humanitarian aid so that his own people can beat back the Russians. And if we were to, Europe and the United States, assist Ukraine in that manner with our advanced weaponry, the Russian forces would not stand a chance, okay? And they would be pushed all the way back to their borders and further if that was the desire. I don't think that's the desire, but I'm just trying to lay it down as to how much superiority we collectively, Europe and the United States, have compared to Russia. But if we are cowardly in appearance, then we are encouraging Russia to continue to invade beyond Ukraine, to hit the Balkans, to hit the Baltics, to hit Poland. We are also incidentally encouraging China to take over Taiwan, which has been a long-term military goal of the People's Republic of China, okay? And you have to show bravery and steadfast intention that is unambiguous against an aggressor, or else the aggressor is going to be encouraged to attack more. That's the lesson of history. And probably the best well-known lesson has to do with Neville Chamberlain and Adolf Hitler. Germany invaded 4 or 5 different countries, parts of the world that were not a part of Germany after World War I, before the Western powers finally figured out that Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler are a threat. Well, we shouldn't do the same thing with Vladimir Putin. We shouldn't do the same thing with Russia. We shouldn't have to wait until a major nation like Poland is divvied up between 2 aggressor nations like the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany before we figure out these people are brutal, they are killers, and we're on their list. We're just further down the list, granted, that's true. We're not at the top. Nazi Germany didn't start off by attacking the United States of America or declaring war on the United States of America. They acquired other territories first, which increased their economic engine, which is necessary to power their military engine. And they also acquired more personnel that they could put into that military engine so that it could do far more damage than it otherwise would have been able to do. Keep in mind, in the 1920s, after World War I, Germany was a very weak nation. It was the unwillingness of Europe and the United States to constrain Germany after World War I that enabled Germany to become the worldwide threat it eventually became, which in turn triggered the deaths of more than 50 million people around the globe.
Congressman, it didn't get a lot of play in this country, but the center left, far left coalition government in France fell this week when the prime minister tried to impose some level of budget cuts and austerity. French governments fall. That's just the way it goes. But the economic issues the government was trying to address is probably the bigger concern. Are you concerned that if France goes into some sort of economic depression as it tries to deal with its indebtedness and its economic issues, that other economies in Europe may similarly go into economic downturns, and something major could happen on the world economic front, beginning with the mess that is France?
Well, France is not one of the world's great economic powers. It's not up with the United States of America or communist China or India, but it's still a very large economy. And it's one of the top 2 or 3 in Europe. And so what happens in France is going to affect its surrounding neighbors, and to some degree will affect the United States of America and some of the other major economic powers around the globe. What Macron is doing to try to prevent France's national insolvency and bankruptcy is the right thing to do. The problem is that our education system generally and our politicians more specifically have failed the peoples of a lot of countries around the globe with respect to the threats associated with national insolvency and bankruptcy, with this dramatic increase in debt that so many nations around the globe are taking on. And I'll give some other examples. And no country is immune from this. Greece went through this problem of a national insolvency and bankruptcy. And the result that they had was an unemployment rate that was above 20%. Those are Great Depression era numbers that we suffer in the United States of America. In Cyprus, when their debt burden became so great and their creditors got a little bit squishy and they wanted greater assurances that the money was going to be paid back that had been loaned, Cyprus confiscated 30, 40, 50% of the monies that were in its citizens' bank accounts, just confiscated them. Okay? This is really bad stuff that happens when a central government loses its solvency. And so the people of France better wake up, just like the people of America need to wake up. But how many schools, particularly government-run schools, how many politicians are doing what it takes to help the population understand the threat posed by these out-of-control debt and deficit numbers? There aren't very many. So as a consequence, the voters in these nations have not connected the dots. They don't understand that this money that is being borrowed is their personal liability. In America, our $37 trillion debt translates into every single man, woman, and child in America owing more than $100,000 apiece. And the synapses in their brains just aren't working right. They can't figure out, too many voters in America, too many voters in countries around the world, that this national debt is a personal liability. Well, who do you think it is that pays the debt? It's the citizens of the country that has the debt. Okay? And in this case with America, it's us. In France's case, it's the citizens of France. And the leaders in France, both in educational institutions and in political institutions, need to do a far superior job of helping the public connect those dots to where they figure out that these runaway debts are personal liabilities of the individual French man, French woman, and French child, French baby, just as the same logic applies to America's debt and American citizenry.
Congressman, we've seen the Ukrainian immigrant who was murdered on the train here recently, and we've seen the left try to make the murderer out to be a victim, saying he was mentally ill. We got a mental health issues in this country. I mean, do you think there's a mental health issue, or these people are so messed up on drugs that it's causing these kind of issues to make somebody attack somebody?
Well, I don't see much difference between mental health issues and drugs because they tend to go hand in hand. A lot of these drugs that people bandy about as being safe, they're not safe. They adversely affect the body. The brain is an organ of the body. The brain is adversely affected. So if you're taking drugs, almost always, you are also adversely affecting mental capacity. And some of the sales pitches that are made out there by know-nothings are just absolutely categorically wrong. And I'll use the most benign drug in the minds of a lot of people, not me, but in the minds of a lot of people. Marijuana has been proven time and time again to have an adverse effect on the thought processes of the brain, just as it probably does on other organs in the body. I mean, people take drugs. Why? Well, because they change things in your body. It might change your outlook. It might change something, but for some reason, you like the feeling of the drug that you're taking. So it's obviously changing you in some shape, form, or fashion. Well, quite often, that change has long-term deleterious effects on your body that you better be cognizant of before you fry your brain and it ain't worth squat. So I don't give anyone any kind of defense in a court of law because the drugs made me do it or the alcohol made me do it. Okay. I discard that. I don't count it. And if anything, that makes the crime worse, not better. If anything, to me, that should make the penalty worse, not better. But that also emphasizes how we've got to do a better job. Again, at the school level, government-run schools have failed us. Again, at the political level with our elected officials, making sure that every citizen of America better understands the medicine that has established time and time again the adverse effects that these drugs, these substances have on your body. And we have not been doing a very good job of it, as evidenced by over 100,000 people killed each year from overdoses of any variety of drugs, fentanyl being a leader.
Along these same lines, last Sunday, a Montgomery man was waiting in a park in Auburn and then jumped out of the woods with a knife and stabbed some poor retired veterinary professor to death while she was walking her dog. We're not trying to make money here. This isn't a drug deal gone bad. There's no explanation for this. And we're a death penalty state, but when we execute, I cover these executions when they happen generally. And, it'd be stuff from like 1994 or 1988 or 2001. Do we need to do a better job of, maybe executing more people and making it a lot sooner to when it happened? Because, realistically, does a 28-year-old man who's probably not that smart really care if he's executed when he's 60?
Probably not. And some of them don't care if they're executed in 2 or 3 years. Some of them don't think they're going to get caught. Okay. But I am a firm believer in the death penalty when murder is involved. Quite frankly, I don't want to spend $20,000 to $30,000 a year of taxpayers' money that can be used to improve other people's lives, keeping a murderer alive. I know that sounds harsh, but I just don't want to do it. There are better things I can do with that money, like improving the lives of orphans or some other group that is in serious need of help. Okay. But we have limited resources, and these people have earned the death penalty when they have imposed the death penalty on a law-abiding citizen. And I understand I'm rather simplistic on it, but I think it's the right policy. But unfortunately, we have a lot of spineless judges. We have a lot of spineless jurors who oppose the death penalty, with the net result being that we have more people getting murdered. And every one of these judges, every one of these jurors who gives a pass to a murderer by not executing them increases the likelihood of more murders. And so they are, whether they like it or not, they are in part responsible for the killings that take place elsewhere of innocent people, not guilty murderers.
Congressman, I didn't have a chance to really go to analyze the jobs report this week. Is our economy, is it looking bad with that?
I don't know if I'd use the word bad, but I would think it's fair to say it's not looking good. Inflation is on the upswing. That's to be expected from Trump's tariffs because it increases the cost of goods with that tax imposition. So, yeah, inflation is undermining the wages that workers get that they would rather take care of their families with. And by the way, I don't think those inflation numbers coming from the federal government are accurate. By way of example, they include a lot of products that I buy, but they also don't include a lot of products that I buy. And when I go to the grocery store, there's no way in the world that inflation is only 3%. I'm looking at the price of eggs, of lettuce, of carrots, of tuna fish, of sardines, of milk, of bread, you name it. It's skyrocketed since I've retired, and I've done a lot more grocery shopping than I used to. Okay. And now on the employment level, uh, employment has gotten worse the last 2 months. The employment rate has slowly but surely ticked up 0.1% for each of the last 2 months. So that's the wrong direction to go. We've had revisions by the Bureau of Labor Statistics that strongly suggest that the numbers were a whole lot worse during the Biden administration than we'd previously been led to believe. And we've also had revisions under the Trump administration that indicate that over Trump's 8 months in office, the economy, particularly employment, has been worse than we were led to believe. And then you've got other data suggests that it's not going to get any prettier in the near term future, that both inflation and employment numbers are going to get worse. We'll see. You never know about the future until the future is the present. And even then, you don't know until it's the past and people have been able to analyze it and get you the data that you need. But the economy is not doing as well as it should. It is struggling. It's far from booming. It might even be in a recessionary state. I pray that's not the case. And I have this hesitancy in my voice because more and more I'm starting to see or perceive that our economic data coming from the federal government has been politicized either by left-wing forces or by Donald Trump or by others. And that tends to make it less and less reliable, which is, as someone who's been involved in economic issues for 40 years, that's scary.
Sort of along those same lines, the farmers that are starting to harvest their crop, I guess due to the tariffs and countries, retaliating against us, corn price is, is hit down to 381 a bushel, which, I mean, it costs $5 a bushel to plant. Soybeans are like 7.47 a bushel in some cash markets. Are we looking at a real farm economy collapse unless something turns around either on the trade front or the government does a bailout to try to keep them operational for another year?
Well, you use the word collapse. No, I don't think we're going to have a collapse. There might be some challenging times that those in the agriculture industry are going to have to deal with. Two things I'd like to emphasize. First is Communist China. They see big agriculture in Alabama. It'd be Farm Bureau or Alpha. In other states, there are different names for these organizations, but they tend to go under the name of Farm Bureau or something similar to that. The Communist Chinese have determined that Farm Bureau and Big Ag are political weaknesses in America that Communist China can exploit to try to continue to expand its economic domination in various sectors of the American economy. And the way that Communist China does that is they say, okay, we're not buying any more soybeans from America, whatever the product may be. And that puts a lot of farmers in a bind. They, in turn, then put pressure on their congressmen and senators and presidents to not do what is necessary to prevent Communist China from doing the kind of damage that it's doing to our overall economy. So that's one of the big factors. But a second factor is there's a global market. If Communist China does not buy from America, that doesn't affect the global market. That affects who American farmers sell to. Well, if Communist China is still going to consume, say, soybeans, they're going to have to buy them from someplace else. And when they buy them from someplace else, well, those other places now can't sell it to other customers in the world because they don't have them to sell. And so what you're going to see over the long term, I think, is America agricultural products will be sold to the consumers around the globe that used to buy from the producers who are now selling to China. So the real key to look at is the global demand for a particular agricultural product like soybeans or corn or wheat or what have you the global production versus the global demand. That's what determines what the pricing is. And quite frankly, in the United States of America, we subsidize agriculture, particularly big ag, with tens of billions of dollars, taxpayer dollars, okay? And we need to reconsider some of those subsidies and recognize that perhaps it's not a wise policy to keep in agriculture farms that are inefficient and cannot compete in this global marketplace. Now, you have to be very careful because we always have to make sure that we are helping agriculture enough to ensure that what we need to eat in America is always being produced. We do not want to go below that floor and risk starvation in America should some kind of international event take place where we're no longer purchasing products from other countries, okay? We always need to ensure that there's enough produced in America to feed Americans. But after that, some of these farms that are horribly inefficient, that only stay in business because of our taxpayer subsidies, we've got to give some consideration to cutting them loose, which in turn means that the productive farms have less competition, which in turn means that they are more survivable.
Well, Congressman, we kept you over 50 minutes. I know you got to get to the lunch with the grandkids, so that's all I have for you, unless Brandon's got anything else.
No, Congressman, thank you so much for being on.
My pleasure. Y'all have a blessed day.
Thank you, Congressman. You too.